Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into geoengineering. It's this really complex set of ideas about intentionally messing with Earth's climate on a huge scale. You've sent over some great material, the basics, who might pay for it, potential downsides. So our mission now is to really dig into the, let's say, the scientific arguments and the ethical minefield these ideas present.
Exactly. We've got that groundwork laid, and now it's time to explore those core disagreements scientists are having.
Yeah.
And yeah, the really tough moral questions that pop up when you talk about deliberately changing the planet's climate.
Okay, let's unpack that reluctance first. It sounds like for quite a while, climate scientists were maybe hesitant to even talk about geoengineering.
Oh, definitely. There was a real wariness.
The worry being it might take the pressure off cutting emissions. That sort of makes sense, doesn't it?
Precisely. It's the moral hazard argument. The fear was if you dangle this potential techno fix, people might think, oh, great, we don't need to make those hard changes after all. Exactly. Why push for difficult societal shifts, maybe economic adjustments, if you think there's an easier escape hatch down the road? That was the concern.
But things seem to be shifting now. You've got some really big names like James Hansen, someone who's been sounding the climate alarm for ages now, saying we need more research.
Yes, that's a notable shift.
And that open letter in 2023, with over 60 scientists signing on, that felt significant. What's behind this change in thinking?
I think a major driver is a growing anxiety, frankly, a concern that the pace of emissions reductions just isn't cutting it. It's not fast enough to avoid some really severe warming scenarios.
So it's not about replacing emission cuts.
For most of these scientists, no. It's more like, could this be a necessary addition, a way to potentially, buy us some critical time while we really accelerate that transition to clean energy? Not a solution in itself, but maybe a stopgap.
Okay, so if the door is creaking open for research, what are the big scientific disagreements? Let's start with, well, would these things even work on a planetary scale? We can't exactly run a test on a spare Earth.
Right. No, we definitely can't. And that's absolutely central to the debate. Our main tool here is complex computer modeling.
Right. Simulations.
Very sophisticated simulations, but they are still simulations. The Earth's climate, it's incredibly interconnected. You've got countless feedback loops.
Where one change causes another, which feeds back.
And honestly, we don't have a perfect grasp on all of them. So there's this inherent uncertainty when you try to translate model results to the real messy world.
So like spraying aerosols in the stratosphere to mimic volcanoes.
Yeah.
The models might say cooling, but how much cooling and where, that's still fuzzy.
Exactly. The degree of cooling, the regional differences, how it plays out in different parts of the world, that's still very much under investigation and frankly debated among scientists.
And okay, beyond just if they work, what else might they do? The side effects. We mentioned rainfall, ozone. Is there any agreement on how bad those could be?
No, not really a consensus, no. You've got differing views. Some scientists believe that with careful deployment and monitoring, maybe you could minimize the negative impacts.
But others are more cautious.
Much more cautious. They warn about potentially major, unpredictable disruptions, changes to monsoon patterns, damage to the ozone layer, impacts on agriculture, ecosystems. It's a long list of potential worries.
Take the aerosol idea again. Could cooling the planet overall lead to, say, serious droughts somewhere else?
That's precisely the kind of scenario different models point towards. Some suggest certain regions could face increased drought risk. So the potential for winners and losers is very real.
And what if we start and then realize, oops, this is going badly. Can we just stop it? That termination problem sounds pretty scary.
It is a very serious concern. The worry is if we become reliant on something like continuous aerosol injections to mask warming from greenhouse gases we've already emitted.
And then we have to stop suddenly. Maybe a tactical failure, a political disagreement, or a side effect pops up.
Then all that mask warming could potentially rush in very, very quickly. A rapid, maybe catastrophic temperature surge. It's a major, major risk factor in these discussions.
Wow, okay. And even just figuring out how to research this stuff seems contentious. Some say stick to computers. Others want small outdoor tests.
Yes, that's another fault line.
But small tests outdoors, that raises questions about safety, oversight. Who decides?
Absolutely. Proponents of small-scale experiments argue they're essential. You need real-world data, they say, to check if the models are right, to understand processes you just can't simulate perfectly.
But the counter-argument
is that even small experiments carry risks, unintended local effects, perhaps. And crucially, we lack agreed-upon rules of the road. There's no clear governance for how to conduct even this kind of research safely and ethically.
Okay, so the science is clearly full of question marks.
Yeah.
But maybe even trickier is the governance side. Who gets to decide? You mentioned there's basically no international rule book for this right now.
That's right. It's a major vacuum. Unlike, say, nuclear weapons or international trade, there's no established global body or treaty specifically designed for geoengineering oversight.
Which leads to this rather alarming possibility you brought up, unilateral deployment, someone just doing it.
Yes. The cost estimates for some techniques, like stratospheric aerosols, are surprisingly low, potentially within reach of a single country, maybe even a very wealthy individual or corporation.
The idea of one actor deciding to tweak the global thermostat based on their own interests, that's, well, terrifying.
It's a deeply concerning prospect. Planet-wide consequences decided and triggered by one entity without any global agreement or oversight. It highlights the governance gap starkly.
But then flip side, getting almost 200 countries to agree on something this controversial. I mean, is global consensus even realistic?
That's the Herculean challenge, isn't it? Given the vastly different priorities, vulnerabilities, and political situations across the globe, achieving consensus would be incredibly difficult. Think about the potential disagreements over what temperature to aim for, what risks are acceptable, who pays.
Yeah, seems almost impossible.
It would certainly be unprecedented.
And then there's fairness, equity. Climate change already hits vulnerable nations hardest. Seems likely geoengineering would have uneven impacts too. How do we make sure the voices of those with the least power are actually heard?
A critical point. History teaches us that the benefits and risks of big technologies often aren't shared equally. They can even worsen existing inequalities.
So how do you build in fairness?
It requires a conscious effort. Ensuring that decision-making processes actively include and consider the perspectives and needs of the most vulnerable populations is absolutely vital for any kind of ethical approach. But it's a huge governance puzzle.
And this all loops back to future generations too, the people who aren't here to have a say.
Absolutely. We'd be making choices now that could lock them into managing or suffering the consequences of these large-scale interventions for decades, maybe centuries.
It's a heavy responsibility.
A profound one. Balancing our present perceived needs against the rights and welfare of those who come after us. It's right at the heart of the ethical debate.
So given all these obstacles, the science gaps, the governance chaos, you can see why some experts are just saying, hold on, full stop. Moratorium on big deployments until we figure this out.
Yes, there are strong calls for a moratorium on large-scale deployment, arguing the risks and uncertainties are just too high without agreed-upon international controls.
But others argue the opposite, right? That we need to develop these tools just in case climate change gets truly out of hand.
Exactly. That's the counter-argument. What if we face truly catastrophic tipping points? Shouldn't we have potential emergency measures researched and potentially ready, even if they're imperfect? It's that tension between precaution and preparedness.
Let's make this more concrete. Harvard's SCoPEx experiment that seemed like a flashpoint, even though it was tiny research. What was that about?
Right. SCoPEx stratospheric controlled perturbation experiment. It was designed as a very small-scale scientific test. The plan was to release a really tiny amount of calcium carbonate, like maybe a couple of kilograms, from a balloon high up.
Not to change the climate, just to study particle behavior.
Precisely. Purely scientific data gathering. To see how particles disperse, interact, things that would help refine the models. No intended climate impact at all from the experiment itself.
But it still kicked up a huge fuss, didn't it? Got postponed in Sweden back in 2021. Why?
Significant controversy, yes. An advisory committee reviewed it and recommended putting it on hold. Key reasons were insufficient public engagement, particularly with the local indigenous Sami people who felt they hadn't been properly consulted.
Ah, the consent issue.
Yes, and also the lack of a clear governance framework. Even for this kind of small-scale research, there weren't established rules about who decides, how risks are assessed, how engagement should happen.
So even a tiny non-climate-altering experiment ran into fundamental questions about who gets a say and the need for rules before you even start.
Exactly. It really threw into sharp relief how complex these issues are.
Yeah.
If we struggled this much with governance for a tiny research project.
Imagine scaling that up to planetary deployment decisions.
It magnifies the challenges immensely. SCoPEx became a sort of microcosm of the larger debate.
So given all this complexity, the science, the governance, the ethics, what does a responsible path forward even look like? Are there any points of agreement on how to handle research?
Well, despite all the disagreements, there does seem to be a growing convergence around some basic principles for research. Things like transparency is key. All research activities should be open.
Makes sense. What else?
International collaboration is crucial. Get diverse perspectives involved, meaningful public engagement, especially with potentially affected communities. That came out of SCoPEx loud and clear.
Governance first.
Yes, developing governance frameworks alongside the science, not after the fact. And critically, always emphasizing that cutting emissions has to be the absolute top priority. Geoengineering research shouldn't detract from that.
Right. Not an excuse to slow down on the main job.
Absolutely not.
And didn't the U.S. National Academies actually recommend setting up a solar geoengineering research program a few years back?
They did in 2021. They suggested a dedicated U.S. research program, maybe around $100–200 million over 5 years.
Which sounds like a lot, but in the grand scheme of climate spending.
It's relatively modest. And importantly, the recommendations stress that this was about building knowledge, understanding the possibilities and risks, not about pushing towards deployment anytime soon. It was framed as one piece of a much larger climate research puzzle.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've really seen the tangle of issues here. Huge scientific question marks. Will it work? What are the side effects? Can we stop it? How do we even study it?
Yeah, the scientific uncertainties are profound. Effectiveness, side effects, reversibility, the research methods themselves, all debated.
And matched by massive governance challenges.
Yeah.
No rules, the risk of rogue actors, the difficulty of global agreement, fairness issues.
Exactly. The lack of international frameworks, the unilateral deployment risk, the equity concerns. These are huge hurdles.
And underlying all of that are these deeper ethical questions, aren't they? Are we playing God? Is it a lesser evil compared to runaway climate change?
Those are fundamental. Plus, questions about justice, who benefits, who pays the price. Is it just another techno-fix that lets us avoid harder societal changes?
The responsibility to future generations hangs over it all, too.
Definitely. It forces us to think about our relationship with technology, with nature itself, and how we make decisions about shared global problems.
It really drives home that for something this big, affecting everyone, you need all the voices at the table,
Right.
not just the scientists or the powerful nations.
Absolutely crucial. Meaningful inclusion of diverse perspectives, especially from vulnerable communities, is non-negotiable if we're going to navigate this responsibly.
So maybe a final thought for you listening. What does it really mean to solve something like climate change? Can technology alone ever be the whole answer? Or does it demand something deeper, a shift in our values, maybe our priorities? And how central should these ethical considerations be when we're guiding the science and tech aimed at tackling global crises? Lots to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.